Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today we're mapping out the incredibly chaotic 60-year swing of industrial power in Britain. If you're an A-level history student, you are in the absolute right place. We're going to take decades of super complex historical data and distill it down into clear, bullet-pointed information. Consider this your ultimate study guide. Let's just dive right into our chronological roadmap. We'll be looking at the 1920s post-war confrontations, World War II cooperation and full employment, the growing unrest of the 50s and 60s, the 1970s winter of discontent, and finally, key themes for your essays. So, starting off with Section 1, the 1920s post-war confrontations. We begin in the highly volatile aftermath of World War I. You've got a fragile, transitioning economy just slamming right into a battle-hardened, heavily unionized workforce. Looking at this timeline, you can literally see the rapid, relentless escalation, starting from local protests in 1919 with Red Clydeside, hitting Black Friday in 1921, and peaking with a nationwide general strike in 1926, before the clampdown of the 1927 Trade Disputes Act. Now just wrap your head around this number. 35 million. That is how many strike days were lost in 1919 alone. I mean, as factories were absorbing huge numbers of men returning from the war, these new jobs were often incredibly poorly paid. And workers weren't just demanding better wages, right? Rising prices and severe food shortages were fueling these massive, widespread grievances. And this quote from Winston Churchill, "Bolshevism is an incendiary act," perfectly captures the government's sheer terror at the time. I mean, think about it. When 90,000 demonstrators filled George Square demanding a 40-hour week and raised the socialist red flag in Glasgow during what became known as Red Clydeside, officials actually sent in tanks and soldiers from England. They genuinely, truly feared a Russian-style revolution breaking out right there on British soil. So an absolutely crucial point for your exams is this regional divide, what historians often call the two Englands. When you're writing your essays, you've got to contrast the booming modern industries of the Midlands and South, where workers were adopting mass production, like motor vehicles and electrical goods. Contrast that with the decaying Victorian-era heavy industries of the North, Wales, and Scotland, places relying on coal, cotton, and shipbuilding, which were declining and notoriously poorly paid. Now, what's really interesting here is how objectively we can track the cause and effect of the 1926 general strike. It all kicked off when the Samuels Commission recommended a staggering 13.5% pay cut for miners. The mine owners locked out workers on May 1st, and the TUC responded by calling a general strike on May 3rd, bringing out 1.5 million workers in solidarity. But look at the government's highly organized pushback. They controlled the narrative using the BBC and their own paper, the British Gazette, all while deploying anti-union volunteers, the OMS, to keep essential services running. Make sure you jot these outcomes down for your revision. The strike completely collapsed after just 9 days, largely due to the OMS getting legal immunity. The miners, well, they held out until December, but they were completely defeated. Their wages were slashed, and the industry lost 30% of its jobs. And most importantly, the government passed the 1927 Trade Disputes Act. This was a massive blow. It made sympathetic strikes and mass picketing illegal, which severely crippled union power for decades. Moving right along to Section 2, World War II, Cooperation and Full Employment. From 1940 to 1945, the dynamic completely flipped. We shift abruptly from bitter confrontation to this essential, highly orchestrated cooperation. With the national government formed in 1940, essential work orders in 1941, and Bevan Boys conscription in 1943, this was an unlikely alliance driven entirely by the sheer necessity of defeating the Axis powers. To see how this worked, let's look at Ernest Bevin. He was a former union leader who was actually made Minister of Labor and given complete control over the workforce. His pragmatic approach fostered joint production committees between workers and management. He introduced essential work orders, which tied workers to employers, but in exchange gave them real job security. The government even conscripted 10% of young men down into the coal mines instead of the army, the famous Bevan Boys. But a quick side note here. Despite all this cooperation, illegal wildcat strikes still happened, like when 100,000 Welsh miners walked out in 1944. So those underlying tensions, they never fully disappeared. Which brings us to Section 3, 1950s to 1960s, Growing Unrest. As peacetime returns, it brings full employment, rising consumerism, and, an incredibly deeply complex web of industrial disputes. From the consumer boom of the 50s, the cultural reflection in the 1959 film I'm All Right, Jack, the 1968 Girling Break Strike, to the infamous In Place of Strife in 1969. This whole era is defined by massive union membership, growing to over 12 million, but behind the scenes we see a crucial fracturing of control. Understanding this internal shift is absolutely vital for your A-levels. The friction wasn't just unions versus the government anymore. It was an internal civil war, kind of. You had senior, affluent union leaders whose mindsets were shaped by post-war austerity, and they were clashing with younger rank-and-file members who wanted their wages to match the 1950s consumer boom. So these unpaid local shop stewards started building their own power bases right on the factory floors. They began calling unofficial, unballoted wildcat strikes. Gradually, the central unions woke up and realized they had completely lost control over their own members. And the public? They definitely noticed this chaos. The 1959 hit film I'm All Right, Jack really reflected how the public was starting to view unions as obstructive. Things got so ridiculous that by 1968, during the Girling Break Strike, a completely trivial dispute over a single oil pump led to 5,000 people being laid off. To try and fix this, Labor Prime Minister Harold Wilson proposed a white paper in 1969 called In Place of Strife, basically trying to mandate strike ballots in cooling-off periods. But it was scrapped due to massive opposition from the unions and Labor MPs. This is a huge turning point. It proved the government was utterly unable to legislate union behavior. All right, let's head into Section 4, the 1970s Winter of Discontent. This is the dramatic climax of our chronological study. The 1970s timeline is essentially a sequence of cascading, escalating crises. We've got the miners' strike in 72, the three-day week in 74, the haulage strike in 78, and of course the winter of discontent in 79. It's an era where soaring inflation and continuous striking literally brought the country to a standstill. 27%. That is the massive pay rise Edward Heath's government completely capitulated to in 1972. They were pretty much forced into it after Union leader Arthur Scargill famously used mobile flying pickets to quickly blockade power stations and coal depots. They were basically holding the nation's energy supply hostage. Things only got worse for Heath between 1970 and 1974. His 1971 Industrial Relations Act failed because the TUC just flat out refused to comply. Then, a miners' strike in 73 and 74 collided with the global oil crisis. Coal shortages got so bad that electricity production plummeted, forcing the government to impose a literal three-day working week just to save energy. This is a textbook example to use in your essays of union action directly impacting the daily lives of every single British citizen. It ultimately toppled Heath's government when he called an election asking who governs Britain, and the voters effectively answered, well, not you. The winter of discontent represents the final swing of the pendulum. By 1978 and 79, Labor's 5% pay restraint policy completely broke down amid soaring inflation. Ford workers went on strike and forced a 17% pay rise. In December, lorry drivers demanded 40%, causing huge petrol and food shortages. And then, in January 79, millions of low-paid public sector workers walked out. The visual shock of this was intense. We're talking unburied bodies because gravediggers were striking and literal mountains of uncollected refuse in city centers. It permanently shattered public support. Positive views of unions plummeted from 60% in 1969 down to just 20% by 1979. Okay, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Key Themes for Your Essays. So, stepping back from the timeline, let's synthesize all this structured, bullet-pointed information into the core thematic arguments you actually need. Treat this table right here as your master revision checklist. Every top-tier A-level essay on this period needs to weave these themes together. Contrast the legislative success of the 1927 Trade Disputes Act with the absolute failure of In Place of Strife. Discuss the regional inequality of the two Englands. Contrast Bevan's WWI cooperation with the peacetime chaos of the 20s and 70s. And always highlight that internal union division between the affluent leadership and the militant shop stewards calling those wildcat strikes. And lastly, track how public opinion shifted from I'm All Right, Jack right through to the winter of discontent backlash. We've seen the pendulum swing from the crushing defeat of the 1926 general strike to the unprecedented unity of World War II, and finally to the devastating visual chaos of the winter of discontent. The evidence is all in your hands now. The real question is, how will you argue the balance of power in your final exam? Thanks for learning with the explainer today, and good luck with your revision.